Exactly 78 years ago, on August 8, 1945, the Red Army began one of its largest offensives of the entire Second World War. In true German style of 40 or 41, the Soviets razed Japanese positions in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia, precipitating the full surrender of the Empire of the Rising Sun just weeks later. The operation that we are going to see next is the little-known Operation August Storm, in which in less than 20 days, the Soviet army completely swept away the Japanese army based in its puppet state of Manchuria, in addition to conquering a series of islands near Japan known as the Kuril and Sakhalin Islands. But before we get to this, let's start at the beginning. Japan's expansion throughout Asia and the Pacific began in the early 1930s, with the Manchuria region being one of its first acquisitions. The dispute over this land went back several decades with both China and Tsarist Russia, and later communist, but by 1932 it was finally the Japanese who prevailed. With respect to all the territory that today includes Korea, this had already been annexed by the year 1910, so with the control of Manchuria, Japan already controlled a good portion of East Asia. By 1937, Japan began another series of attacks directed to the north and east of China, annexing much Chinese territory again. This event is known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, to which finally we must add the last expansion of Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, facing the Pacific. After a first period in which Japan came to control most of the South Pacific and the entire eastern coast of Asia, from mid-1942 it gradually lost ground until its final surrender in September 1945, just 1 month after the start of the offensive that we are going to see next. Well, once we have seen this, let's see what was the only incident that the Japanese army had with the Soviet Union before the enormous attack by the Red Army. It was specifically in the middle of 1939, in the well-known Battle of Jalgin-Gol, which lasted from May to September 16 of that same year. As we can see, it ended just when the Russians invaded Poland together with the Germans. This first and only trial resulted in a victory for the Soviets and meant that the Japanese would never appear in the area again, to the misfortune of the Germans who would wait for 1941 to join their war against the Soviet Union. Although Italy, Japan, and Germany had signed the Tripartite Pact in 1940, in which they promised to help each other in future military conflicts, it did not make clear the supposed commitment if the Soviet Union was involved. Thus, Japan came to sign its own neutrality pact with the Soviets in April 1941, which it would abide by throughout the conflict. So much so, that Japan did not attack the ships that came to the Soviet coast from the United States with abundant war material. These guarantees that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union, being these of total confidence, were what allowed the massive dispatch of troops at the end of 1941, from the border zone of the Soviet Union with Japan, to the surroundings of Moscow, contributing to the paralysis of the German offensive and the subsequent counterattack. This is why it is said that the alliance of the Axis parties was one of the worst in all of history, since they practically never really helped each other. Although this would be the cause of a wide debate, it is very possible that if Germany and Japan had reached a minimal agreement to attack the Soviet Union, the result of the war would have been very different. This is because the Soviets would have had to maintain many troops in the Russian Pacific zone, and this country would have been fighting on two fronts. In any case, and now focusing on the subject of the video, the Soviet Union led a war on a single front, also counting on material aid from the United States that the Japanese did not do much to prevent, because they did not want any type of conflict with the Soviets. Unfortunately for them, however, it ended up getting to them anyway. It was specifically after the fall of Germany in May 1945 when Stalin had to fulfill the pact that he had agreed with the Americans at the Yalta Conference, which had taken place in February of that same year. At that conference, he had promised to launch an attack on Japan, just 3 months after the end of the war in Europe. Thus, complying with the calendar, by the beginning of August 1945, exactly 3 months after the surrender of Germany, the Soviet army was already fully prepared and in a position to carry out its invasion of Manchuria, Korea, and other islands close to Japan. The forces used for such an operation were more than 1.5 million soldiers, 5,000 battle tanks and another 5,000 aircraft. And it is that to give us an idea of the magnitude of this operation, the forces used in it were slightly less than those used against Germany in 1944 in the Bagration operation. Although during the summer of 1944 they managed to completely overwhelm the German defenses, in this new summer of 1945 it was not going to be different against Japan. The attack strategy was similar to that used by the Germans when they attacked Poland in 1939, using a double clamp. This is exactly what the Soviets did, using the opportunities offered by the terrain and their positions, completely encircling and annihilating the Japanese forces, which numbered about 700,000 soldiers, in just a few days. The rate of advance that had been set for Soviet infantry units was 30 kilometers a day, and 70 kilometers for armored formations. This operation was fraught with risk, as it did not tolerate delays, including also the supply lines that would have to move just as fast. It should be noted that the Soviet units were veterans and were very battle-hardened, while the Japanese in that area were occupation troops that for the most part had not fought. In any case, if they had done it, it had been at some point in the Pacific, and they were not at all familiar with this type of offensive that the Soviet Union launched, so they were completely overwhelmed. The first pincer was launched in northern Manchuria, with the city of Qiqihar as its junction point. Of the 10 armies that Japan had in the entire region, there were only 2 in this sector, and with practically no resistance, they were easily overcome by the Red Army units. The bulk of the Japanese armies, totaling 6, were concentrated north of the current North Korean border, right in the center of Manchuria. Because the border was so wide and full of ledges, they would never have been able to protect it all effectively, so their only chance was to stay behind. However, and despite this, nothing could be done when the Soviet avalanche broke out on them. This was the attack of the second pincer, which would cross Mongolia from the west, and would also penetrate from the eastern border of Manchuria at the height of Vladivostok. Their meeting point was the cities of Harbin and Changchun, which are located right in the center of Manchuria. Faced with such an offensive, nothing could be done by the Japanese armies, which collapsed even earlier than the Soviets planned when they planned this attack. As if that were not enough, let us also think that this offensive began just 2 days after the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and 1 day before Nagasaki, so they finished delivering the coup de grace to the Japanese Empire. But even with these last 2 actions of the atomic bomb and the Soviet invasion, by those dates the Japanese army and navy had already been completely defeated in the Pacific, and the defense of the island of Japan itself was being prepared against a possible United States invasion. It is very possible that the United States would not have carried out this invasion operation on the island of Japan, since it would be something similar to the Battle of Berlin but multiplied by 10. Instead, they would have limited themselves to a massive bombardment until they achieved the Japanese surrender. However, it is not so clear that the Red Army had not entered Japan in full force. Thus, by the end of August 1945, with Manchuria, Korea, the Kuril Islands and most of the Japanese possessions in Asia lost, facing the danger of an imminent land invasion, and having received the drop of 2 atomic bombs on its soil, and waiting for some more, by the beginning of September 1945, Japan signed its surrender. It is here when it is highlighted that the only condition to carry out this surrender was that the Emperor of Japan was neither tried nor deposed, and was kept in office, this being the real reason why many point out that Japan finally gave up. This Soviet action in the area, which we must not forget, was requested by the United States itself, although it is also possible that it was Stalin himself who wanted to enter said area to annex new territories. It was the origin of the future Korean War and helped largely to the rise of Communist China. And so far this program on one of the largest offensives of World War II, which has gone virtually unnoticed in the history books. Thank you all so much for being part of this community, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you as always every Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.